Hungary, in recent years, has been making vigorous efforts to obstruct the delivery of European Union aid to Ukraine. It also stalled Sweden's accession into NATO and significantly limited support for Ukrainian refugees. But it is still the country presiding over the European Council, far from being isolated internationally. So, whose side is Viktor Orban really on? Good evening, my name is Mateusz Mazzini, and this is Wider View. Our main story tonight focuses on Hungary, or, as some like to call it, the troublemaker of Europe. It is no secret that the EU has a problem with the government in Budapest. Since taking office in 2010, Viktor Orban has been continuously violating the rule of law, asking for exceptions from EU policies, and marginalizing opposition actors. But recently, his actions have begun to appear more brazen. He cut off financial aid from 3,000 Ukrainian refugees and eased visa restrictions for citizens of Russia and Belarus. He's also flirting with China and other powers hostile to the West. So we take stock of Orban's past, present, and future in our first report.
Viktor Orban first came to prominence as a pro-democracy activist in the late 1980s. He got involved in Hungary's anti-communist opposition movement and quickly became one of its most recognizable figures. He briefly left Hungary to study political philosophy at Oxford University on a scholarship from the Soros Foundation. The liberal billionaire was initially his donor, but later became the arch-enemy of Orban's political project. Upon returning from the United Kingdom, he ran for office for the first time. By winning a seat in the parliament, he began one of the longest and most controversial political careers in Europe today. Elected as a chairman of Fidesz in 1993, he transformed the party from a liberal group into an ultra-conservative party. As prime minister, first appointed in 1998, he led Hungary through the NATO accession process. But Orbán's premiership lasted only one term, as he failed to construct a working majority in later elections. Fidesz, still led by him, returned to power in 2010, and he has been clinging to it ever since. Throughout his 14 years in government, he's implemented widespread systemic reforms, altering the workings of the Hungarian state. Court backing, the near-total elimination of independent media, and the crackdown on Central European University are only his most infamous moves. Orbán has also ushered in a balancing act in foreign policy. He clashed with Brussels enough to contest European policies, but not so much that he would risk serious isolation. Even as the bad boy of the EU, he still very often gets what he wants.
Is the European Union helpless in the face of Hungarian disobedience? How close is Viktor Orban really to Vladimir Putin? And actually, is Hungary still a functioning democracy? A lot of these questions get asked in the media very often, but we will actually try to answer them with the help of our experts. Joining me tonight are Daniel Hegedüs, Regional Director at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, Gabor Scheiring, Assistant Professor at Georgetown University, Qatar, and András László Pap, Visiting Professor at Central European University. Gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Wider View. And András, I want to begin with you straight away and ask you to give us the latest on the current political developments in Hungary, because from the outset, it seems to be the case that for the first time in many, many years, Viktor Orban seems to have a challenger. We have a new prominent figure, Péter Magyar. His party is trailing Fidesz in opinion polls. So if you could break it down for us, who is he, who are his people, and can he really threaten Orban's position in power?
Thank you very much. Let me begin by saying that I'm a constitutional lawyer, so I'm not a political scientist, and I'm certainly not a political analyst, but I'm still, nevertheless, happy to leave my intellectual academic comfort zone to answer your question. So, yes, on the one hand, it does appear that for the first time, polling shows a quite it appears that Orban and his brand new challenger actually seem to be side by side. Some polls even say that Orban is slightly behind his most prominent opponent. I wouldn't say, by the way, that this is for the first time, because in 2022, the last parliamentary elections, for the first time in Hungary, there were primaries, and there was a unified, almost all opposition parties were part of a unified opposition platform, which did lose and had lost with and Orban has secured yet another 2/3 majority in parliament. But given the peculiarity or the specialties of the Hungarian electoral system, actually a 2/3 parliamentary majority is not that different from a single slim victory. But anyway, so this is just to say that it's actually not the first time that Orban's continuous power is being threatened, but this actually appears to be something new. This actually appears to be a novel and a new voice that seems to attract a significant part of the electorate. New people are appearing to be siding with Péter Magyar, this new brand new candidate. No one has known his name a year ago. Basically, he has surfaced as the ex-husband of a former Minister of Justice who, among the president, had to resign from office due to controversial political scandal, and he, a former beneficiary of the Orbán regime, has actually appeared to raise a voice that seems to be attractive and honest and genuine enough to attract supporters that seem to be new and seem to be constituting a new majority.
So I think the most important part of what you're telling us, András, is that he actually does stand a chance to perhaps challenge Orban as a figure, as a unifying figure of the opposition. So Daniel, over to you, and a more systemic look at this question. Can Orban be actually challenged through a democratic ballot, or maybe through his systemic reforms, through the change of constitution and the electoral law, etc., he created a system that's so unbelievably watertight that it almost becomes impossible for him to lose, which for many of political scientists would mean that Hungary isn't actually a functioning democracy anymore.
Good evening. And yes, I think I fundamentally agree with those political scientists. We could best categorize Hungary as an electoral autocracy. And actually, it's important to underline that Hungary has had its last free and fair elections actually 14 years ago, back in 2010. But this conclusion doesn't exclude the opportunity that incumbents can actually lose elections, even in hybrid regimes, non-democratic regimes. I think the main question is not whether Prime Minister Orban can lose an election. The main question is whether the new incumbent will be able to effectively govern the country with democratic means. And in this regard, I think our answer is a unequivocal no, because the level of the state capture, which was created over the past 14 years in Hungary, which does not only include constitutional checks and balances, but really a true sort of a deep state, which conquered actually practically from the culture and education to broad segments of economic power, all important parts of the public life in Hungary, can be very difficult to be deconstructed. And I think Poland shows the best example how difficult it is to get back from a state capture to democratic governance, even though the level of the state capture in Poland remained much, much shallower than in Hungary. So ultimately, the conclusion is that, yes, there is a chance for Péter Magyar or a new challenger at the elections in 2026, but that won't necessarily mean a democratic transition per se.
Absolutely, and that's a very good point that you raise here, Daniel. We see that in Poland, it almost becomes obvious that it's better to have a populist incumbent rather than a populist actor, a former populist incumbent in opposition, because they point to how efficient they were in power. But Gabor, the other side of this equation is obviously the Hungarian people. And I don't think that voice, that perspective really transpires in the media very often. So let's look at the 14 years in power of Orban from a domestic perspective, because for the most part, he seems to be remaining on immensely high levels of popularity. So have his governance ideas or his policies been very beneficial to Hungarians? Why is that he remains so popular? Is it through the economy? Is it through storytelling? Or is it all of those things?
It's all of those things to answer very shortly, but there's also a very significant change throughout his tenure. So the first couple of cycles were more successful economically. And I think the easiest is to divide his period in government before and after the COVID crisis. So right until the COVID crisis, real wages have been increasing significantly through rather questionable means, but Orbán has managed to increase employment significantly. And compared to the previous period, for many people, these things represented a very significant improvement. And that helped Orbán to stay in power. But at the same time, we also have to see that other countries in the region have been doing even better. So Orbán was lucky in a sense that he governed in a period before COVID that was very much beneficial for almost the totality of Eastern Europe. So just to give you one statistic, real wages have been increasing very significantly under the first 10 years of Orbán's stay in power from 2010 to 2020, almost doubled. But at the same time, from the second half of the 2000s until now, basically, the value of Hungarian wages, if you compare it to other countries in Europe, Hungary was around sixth from the bottom before Orbán took power, and now it's the second from the bottom.
That's
so even though
very telling. That is a very telling statistic. And apologies for jumping on your point here, Gabor, but we will pause the discussion here and move away from the domestic perspective on Orbán's illiberalism, because that political project has also an international face. So now let's have a look at how Budapest sees the world and how the world sees Budapest. Viktor Orbán is no friend of the liberal West. Sounds trivial, but it is very true nonetheless. But he isn't just a critic of the EU or the Biden administration. He actively shapes the landscape of the global far right, acting as an inspiration for many. Our next report examines the Hungarian Prime Minister's global influence.
After their electoral defeat in 2020, many of Donald Trump's acolytes sought political refuge abroad. They found it in Budapest, where Fidesz was very welcoming to their ideas and their presence. Politicians such as Steve Bannon, Mike Pence, and Mike Pompeo all visited Hungary, delivering speeches and working with think tanks. Last year, the American right even ran a franchise of its flagship event, the Conservative Political Action Conference, or CPAC, in Budapest. Viktor Orbán appeared on Tucker Carlson's Fox News show, and Donald Trump praised him as a tough guy who runs Hungary. In other places, such as Brazil under Jair Bolsonaro, he became a role model for strongman populist leadership. At the same time, Orbán developed a closer relationship with Vladimir Putin. Just recently, his government eased visa restrictions for Russian and Belarusian citizens. The move triggered sharp reactions from Brussels, as some saw it as a potential security risk for the EU. In the first days of his EU presidency, Orbán also went on a solo trip to Kiev, Moscow, and Beijing. He claims it was an individual effort to broker peace in Ukraine. He also made it clear that the initiative was his own, not that of the EU. The longer the presidency has been going on, the more controversies arose. Just this week, Orbán traveled to Georgia to meet with pro-Russian political actors there. He also welcomed the Chinese leader Xi Jinping last May. Viktor Orbán might be a prime minister of a small country, but his ambitions are most certainly global.
Daniel, time for some almost breaking news on our show. On Monday, Viktor Orban traveled to Georgia to congratulate the Georgian Dream Party on their very much questionable so far electoral victory. You wrote yourself on the website on the German Marshall Fund of the United States that this is something that you consider an interference on behalf of Orban into Georgia's domestic politics. What is he doing it for? What's the end game of Orban's travel to Georgia right now?
Yes, I think we have seen that actually the main logic of the Hungarian Council presidency over the past couple of months was to sow disruption in the EU foreign policy. And actually that mirrors the logic what the whole regime applies to foreign policy. On the one hand, they created very strong ties with contenders of the West, authoritarian great powers like Russia, China, and they are using these ties actually as leverage over the official alliance system of the country, the European Union, the United States, actually to influence the reactions on Hungary's autocratization. And his intervention in Georgia serves the same goal. Actually, he's fostering Russian strategic interest with that move and is disrupting EU foreign and also enlargement policy with that regard. And here, I think it's important to underline that it's not only a violation of Georgian sovereignty, it's not only a clear interference into Georgian domestic affairs, where actually the irony is that Prime Minister Orban pretty often actually calls wolf due to alleged interference into Hungarian domestic affairs, but it's also a very clear violation of the principle of sincere cooperation within the European Union. He's acting against the pre-agreed policy line of the European Union with regard to Georgia. And however, I think it's pretty telling that the European Union was barely able to respond to this provocation. The German-led initiative, which resulted in a statement condemning both the election irregularities committed by the Georgian Dream Party and Orban's visit, was ultimately only signed by 15 members of the European Union, meaning that for 11 member states, this provocation is not even meeting the threshold for signing a statement.
Okay,
and
so we're going to talk,
yeah.
I'm going to interrupt you here for a second because we're going to talk about the limits to Brussels' patience, whether there are any actually, in a second. But I wanted to turn to Gabor now and ask you about other countries, because we know that Putin isn't the only leader that's openly hostile to the West that Orban tries to have a relationship with. The other one is Xi Jinping. He hosted the Chinese leader back in May during his tour of Europe. Is this, in both cases, Russia and China, a purely economic relationship, or is there more to it from a political, ideological, or any other dimension to look at?
I think there's a political aspect to it. So Orban hates the fact that that the Western leaders are trying to discipline him. So he's seeking alliances that can increase his room to maneuver. So that's the political aspect. There's the ideological aspect where he really believes that the Western, the dominance of Western liberalism is about to end, and he is trying to align himself with non-Western rising powers, also ideologically.
So there's pardon for interrupting you. It's sort of like a preemptive strike. I know that the guys in Europe and DC are decreasing on the downside, so I'm going to move to the guys that are riding the wave right now. Is that what he thinks?
Yeah, and also he sees that this has a cultural aspect, right? He thinks that this Western liberalism has failed to protect its own Western interests, whereas he sees these strong guys in the East, and he thinks that in many ways that's a more preferable model economically, culturally. But at the same time, he also likes to present himself as the kind of a strongman who protects Europe from the East. So he's kind of not really going East, but also not really willing to align with the West, but trying to kind of play this intermediary game. And this has a very important economic angle to it, because foreign investment has been very important in Hungary until recently, especially before Orbán took power. But under him, the role of new foreign investment inflow into the country has declined. Initially, European financial support subsidies have replaced those foreign investments, but now that's already gone. So there's a real need for new foreign investment, and Orbán hopes that that could come from China. And last year, he did score a few big wins with Chinese investments in manufacturing, but that still China's role is significantly smaller, and it's highly questionable whether China could really replace the economic role as main investor compared to Western foreign investment.
Well, he wouldn't be the first European politician to try that maneuver. We're going to see whether he's going to succeed. But András, over to you and back to the limits of the relationship with Brussels. From his own declarations, we know very well what Viktor Orban says he thinks of the European Union. But somehow, miraculously, he's still on the inside, never asked to leave. So what is Viktor Orban's real, tangible perspective on the European law, European legislation, the rule of law principles, and all the things that are foundational principles of the European Union?
Yes, I'm actually more skeptical about Orban's ideological mission or the genuineness of anything he says. I think what best describes the Hungarian illiberal regime is kleptocracy. I mean, Orban's chief political advisor has admitted years ago that what is referred to as corruption is actually the model that they are building on. So I think the only reason that actually motivates, I mean, Orban is extremely talented, very charismatic. He has wonderful advice. He really sees the zeitgeist. He understands the rhetoric that a lot of people are talking about, the decline of the West, etc. But I don't think he believes in any of that. I think what he's interested in is the more and more influx of money, both from the European Union as well as Chinese investors, factories. The Russian relationship is a little bit more complicated. So I actually genuinely question any of the doctrinal or philosophical coherence of anything he says. The reason why he's in the European Union is because, by the way, partly because the EU still has Hungary within its ranks, is that it has created very lucrative deals and a very comfortable economic environment for first German car industries and all So he has obviously no. I don't think he has any interest in leaving the EU. Obviously, he's very unhappy about the lack of EU money flooding in, and I think that's one of the reasons why his political regime may actually collapse, because there's much less money to transform to oligarchs and his family enterprises.
So smooth operator Viktor Orban. So to conclude, as promised, back to you, Daniel. We don't have much time, so I'm going to ask you for a very concise answer to a very difficult question. What are the limits of Brussels' patience to Viktor Orban? How long will the rest of Europe have to tolerate a rogue agent that doesn't care about the European Union's principles and policies and plays his own game?
Very briefly, I don't think that Europe's patience can come to an end, because actually the political shifts within the European Union is clearly favoring Prime Minister Orban. There was no clear breakthrough of the radical right at the European Parliament elections, but we see actually an increasing breakthrough of illiberal radical right. Orban's intra-EU political allying partners at the national elections. And we have seen actually how member parties of his newly founded Patriots for Europe ranked first at the Austrian elections or polled first in the upcoming Czech elections. And against that background, I think even within the European Union, the dynamics are rather favoring the Hungarian Prime Minister instead of isolating.
So I'm afraid this is all we have time for tonight. And even though we seem to have a consensus over Viktor Orban's authoritarianism, he is here to stay, and we will continue to cover him on our show. Daniel Hegedüs, Gabor Scheiring, and András László Pap were our guests tonight. Thank you for being with us. Whatever you think of Viktor Orban, his political talent is impressive. It certainly stretches beyond just being the Prime Minister of Hungary. He wants more. Where will he stop? That's hard to predict. But one thing is certain. There is a lot to learn from him, even if you sit on the opposite side of the political spectrum. Thank you for being with us tonight. Next week, as the US presidential campaign comes to an end, we will examine the phenomenon of losers' consent. Or why is it so difficult these days for people to accept defeat in a democracy? Make sure you're with us next Thursday, and have a good evening.